July 13, 1993. Davey Allison walked across the tarmac at Bessemer Airport with the kind of confidence that comes from being born into speed. 20 years behind the wheel of race cars, 300 hours in the cockpit of aircraft, third-generation driver carrying a last name that meant something in Alabama, in NASCAR, in every dirt track and superspeedway from Daytona to Talladega. The Hughes 369HS helicopter sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Davey had bought it 6 months earlier for $250,000. Made sense at the time. Flying between races cut travel time in half, let him be home with Liz and the kids more often, gave him an edge over drivers still grinding through airport terminals and rental car lines. The math worked. The freedom felt right. Red Farmer stood beside the aircraft, 52 years old, weathered hands checking the exterior panels out of habit more than necessity. Red had been flying since Davey was in diapers, had raced alongside Davey's father Bobby, back when stock cars were actually stock and safety meant a lap belt and a prayer. Red flew co-pilot on these trips because Davey asked and because saying no to an Allison felt wrong in this part of the country. "Ready when you are," Red said, voice barely carrying over the distant hum of Interstate 20 traffic. Davey nodded, running through the pre-flight checklist in his head. 300 hours wasn't a lot. He knew that. His instructor had told him that. But 300 hours was more than most people ever logged, and Davey Allison had never done anything halfway in his life. Racing was in his blood. Flying was just racing in 3 dimensions. He understood machines, trusted his hands, trusted his instincts. The destination was 40 minutes northeast, Talladega Superspeedway. The same track where his father had nearly died 5 years earlier, where the family name was etched into Victory Lane asphalt and also into emergency room records. Neil Bonnett was there today, recovering from his own crash injuries, and Davey wanted to see him. Check on his mentor, his friend, the man who taught him half of what he knew about taking a turn at 200 miles per hour. They climbed into the cockpit. Davey took the pilot seat. Red settled in beside him, buckled the harness across his chest. The instrument panel glowed to life as Davey went through startup procedures. Rotor blades began their slow rotation overhead, cutting the humid Alabama air with that distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop sound that always made Davey's pulse quicken just slightly. "Tower, this is Hughes, November 727. Whiskey Sierra requesting departure clearance," Davey said into the radio, voice steady, professional. Clearance came back. Winds light and variable, visibility unlimited, perfect flying weather. The helicopter lifted smoothly off the tarmac. Davey brought it up to cruising altitude, pointed the nose toward Talladega. Below them, Alabama rolled past in patches of pine forest and red clay, and the occasional town too small to have a name anyone outside the county would recognize. The cockpit smelled like hot metal and hydraulic fluid, and the faint chemical tang of new upholstery. Red didn't talk much during the flight. Neither did Davey. Both men comfortable with silence, with the mechanical rhythm of flight, with the hum of the engine and the whisper of air moving past the canopy. Davey thought about the season, thought about the point standings, thought about the Winston Cup championship that felt close enough to taste. His brother Clifford had died 11 months ago in a practice crash at Michigan. 11 months. The grief still sat in Davey's chest, like a stone he couldn't cough up, couldn't swallow down. Racing was supposed to be dangerous. Everyone knew that. But knowing it and living it were different things entirely. The Talladega infield came into view ahead. Davey began his descent approach, dropping altitude gradually, making the transition from cruise to landing pattern. He'd done this dozens of times before. Nothing complicated about it. Just a matter of controlling descent rate, maintaining forward speed, picking the right spot to set down. Red glanced at the altimeter, at the airspeed indicator, at Davey's hands on the controls. Everything looked fine. Everything felt fine. The helicopter cleared the perimeter fence at 3,000 feet, began its final approach over the vast expanse of Talladega Superspeedway. From this altitude, the track looked like a child's toy. The grandstands empty and skeletal in the midday heat, The infield a patchwork of service roads and garage buildings, and that small cleared area where the helipad sat waiting. Neil Bonnett was down there somewhere, probably standing in the shade watching the sky, waiting for his friend to arrive. Red kept his eyes on the instruments, on the descent rate, on the way Davey's hands moved across the controls, with the kind of casual precision that came from 10,000 laps around oval tracks, from muscle memory built into fingertips and wrists and shoulders. The altimeter unwound. 2,000 feet, 1,500. The ground rose up to meet them, details sharpening into focus, individual trees becoming visible, the white paint of the helipad growing larger in the windscreen. Davey adjusted collective pitch, eased back on the cyclic, making the small corrections that kept a helicopter balanced between sky and earth. The wind was almost nothing today, barely a whisper across the rotor blades, and the Hughes responded smoothly to every input. Red had flown in worse conditions 100 times. This was textbook. This was easy. 1,000 feet. The helipad directly ahead now, maybe 200 yards out. Davey began his final descent, dropping the helicopter in a controlled glide. Forward speed bleeding off, everything by the numbers. Red glanced over, saw Davey's face in profile, saw the concentration there, the same expression he wore behind the wheel of a race car when threading through traffic at 190 miles per hour. Nothing unusual, nothing concerning, just a pilot bringing his aircraft home. And then something changed. Red felt it before he saw it. A shift in the helicopter's attitude, a sudden wrongness in the way the aircraft hung in the air. The nose dipped, the tail kicked slightly right. Davey's hands moved on the controls, correcting, but the correction came too late, or too strong, or both, and the Hughes lurched upward instead of continuing its descent, climbing 10 feet, 15, the engine roaring as collective pitch increased past where it should have been. "Davey," Red said, voice cutting through the cockpit noise. Davey didn't respond. His hands moved again on the controls, trying to bring the helicopter back under control, trying to arrest the climb and resume the descent. But the Hughes wasn't responding the way it should have. The aircraft rotated left, then right, the tail swinging through an arc that made Red's stomach drop. They were too low for this, too slow. The margins were gone. The helicopter was a machine that demanded constant attention, constant inputs, and something had broken in that loop between Davey's hands and the aircraft's response. The Hughes dropped, not a controlled descent, a fall. Red saw the ground rushing up, saw the helipad and the grass beyond it, and the fence posts and the shocked faces of people who'd been standing there waiting and were now running, scrambling away from what was about to happen. The helicopter hit on the passenger side, Red's side, the impact crushing metal and shattering plexiglass and driving the breath out of Red's lungs in a single explosive gasp. The rotor blades screamed as they struck earth, fragmenting, sending pieces spinning through the air like shrapnel. The fuselage rolled onto its side, momentum carrying it several feet across the grass before friction and destroyed metal brought everything to a grinding, terrible stop. Silence came next. Not complete silence. The hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid, the tick of hot metal cooling, someone shouting from far away. But after the violence of the crash, after the noise of impact and destruction, the sudden absence of engine roar felt like being underwater, like the world had been wrapped in cotton and buried 6 feet deep. Red Farmer was conscious. He knew that much. Could feel the harness cutting across his chest, could taste blood in his mouth, could hear his own breathing, ragged and wet, in a way that meant broken ribs, punctured lung, internal damage he didn't want to think about. Pain radiated from his right side, a white-hot fire that made every breath an act of will. He turned his head, slow, careful, and looked across the destroyed cockpit at Davey Allison. Davey was moving. His eyes were open. That seemed impossible given the way the pilot's side of the aircraft looked, the way the canopy had collapsed inward, the way blood covered everything. But Davey's eyes were open and tracking, and his mouth was moving though no sound came out. People were running toward the wreckage now, Neil Bonnett in the lead, face white with shock, hands reaching for the twisted metal, trying to find a way in, trying to help. Red wanted to say something. Wanted to tell them to be careful of the fuel lines. of the hot engine components, of the jagged edges of torn aluminum that could open an artery as easy as breathing. But his voice wouldn't work. His lungs wouldn't fill properly. All he could do was watch as they pulled the canopy frame away, as they reached in for Davey, as they lifted him out with the kind of desperate gentleness reserved for broken things that might shatter completely with the wrong touch. The medical helicopter arrived 14 minutes later. 14 minutes that felt like 14 hours. They loaded Davey onto a stretcher, started IVs in both arms, wrapped his head in gauze that soaked through Red almost immediately. Red got loaded second, his breathing worse now, vision starting to tunnel at the edges, but he kept his eyes on Davey, on the paramedics working over him, on the organized chaos of emergency medicine happening in real time. The flight to Caraway Methodist Medical Center in Birmingham took 18 minutes. Red counted every one of them, counted the rhythm of the rotors overhead, the rhythm so different from the Hughes, the sound of a machine that was working exactly as designed, exactly as intended. They wheeled Davey into surgery at 4:17 in the afternoon. The trauma team had been waiting, had been notified during the flight, had prepped operating room 3 for what they knew was coming. Dr. James Andrews led the team, neurosurgeon with 20 years of experience, hands that had saved lives in circumstances just as desperate as this one. He opened Davey's skull and saw the damage underneath. Massive intracranial hemorrhage, swelling that compressed the brainstem. Injuries that even in 1993, even with the best surgeons and the best equipment, left almost no margin for hope. Liz Allison arrived at the hospital at 6:30, brought by state troopers who'd driven with lights and sirens from Hueytown. Her 2 children stayed with family. She didn't need to be told how bad it was. She could see it in the faces of the doctors, in the way the nurses looked at her with that particular expression that meant they'd already started grieving, already started the mental process of accepting what was coming. Bobby Allison arrived an hour later, still recovering from his own injuries, from the crash that had nearly killed him 5 years earlier, from the death of his son Clifford 11 months ago, and now this, now Davey, now his remaining son lying in a hospital bed with machines breathing for him and tubes carrying blood and medicine into veins that were trying so hard to keep fighting. Davey Allison died at 7:00 the next morning, July 14, 1993. 32 years old, champion driver, husband, father, third generation of a racing family that had given everything to the sport and now had nothing left to give. The official cause of death was listed as massive head trauma sustained in helicopter accident. The unofficial cause was harder to quantify, harder to write on a form. Harder to explain to the thousands of fans who woke up that Wednesday morning to news reports and radio announcements, and the shared grief of a community that had just lost one of its heroes. The NASCAR world stopped. Races continued, because races always continued, but the joy went out of them for a while. Drivers wore black armbands. Crew chiefs dedicated victories to Davey's memory. Track officials held moments of silence. And in Hueytown, Alabama, population 6,200, a town that had produced more famous drivers per capita than anywhere else on Earth, they closed the schools and the shops and the restaurants, and they mourned together the way small towns do, with casseroles and tears and the shared understanding that some losses cut too deep for words to reach. The National Transportation Safety Board arrived at Talladega Superspeedway on July 15, less than 48 hours after the crash, carrying cameras and measuring tools and clipboards thick with forms that needed filling. Federal investigators in windbreakers and steel-toed boots, faces professionally neutral, voices trained to ask questions without implying answers. They photographed the wreckage from every angle, documented the scatter pattern of debris, measured the distance from initial impact to final resting position. They interviewed witnesses, recorded testimonies, collected physical evidence in sealed bags labeled with case numbers and chain of custody documentation. This was what the NTSB did. This was the machinery of official investigation, grinding forward with bureaucratic precision, regardless of grief or emotion, or the fact that an entire state was still reeling from loss. The preliminary findings came quickly because the evidence was straightforward, because helicopter crashes leave clear signatures in twisted metal and ground scars, because the flight data and witness accounts all pointed in the same direction. No mechanical failure. The Hughes 369HS had been inspected and certified airworthy 3 weeks before the accident. Engine performance was normal throughout the flight, no evidence of structural failure, no indication of control system malfunction, no bird strike or foreign object damage, or any of the 100 other things that could bring an aircraft down without warning. The weather that afternoon had been nearly perfect. Winds light and variable, visibility unlimited, no turbulence or wind shear or atmospheric conditions that would challenge even a novice pilot. Red Farmer gave his statement from a hospital bed in Birmingham, ribs wrapped, lung reinflated, voice still weak but memory sharp and clear. He told them about the approach, about the descent that had been normal until it wasn't, about the sudden change in aircraft attitude that happened so fast he barely had time to register it before impact. Davey got low, Red said, choosing his words carefully, aware that every syllable would be transcribed and analyzed and potentially used to assign blame to a dead man who couldn't defend himself. He came in too low and too fast on the final approach. I saw him try to correct. Saw him pull up, but it was too late by then. We were out of altitude and out of airspeed and out of options. The NTSB interviewed Neil Bonnett, who'd been standing at the helipad waiting for his friend, who'd watched the whole thing happen from ground level with perfect clarity. Neil described the helicopter's erratic behavior in those final seconds, the way it seemed to porpoise in the air, climbing when it should have been descending, rotating when it should have been stable. He mentioned that Davey had only recently received his helicopter rating, that 300 hours was not a lot of experience, that the Hughes model required specific training and practice to master. Neil's voice cracked twice during the interview. The investigators noted it in their report but didn't comment. Grief was not their jurisdiction. The final report, released 6 months later in January 1994, ran to 43 pages of technical language and detailed analysis, but the conclusion fit into a single sentence that would be quoted in every news article and every retrospective for decades to come. The National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's failure to maintain adequate altitude and airspeed, and his improper recovery from a bounced landing, which resulted in an in-flight loss of control. In plain language, pilot error. In blunter language, Davey Allison had made a mistake, had misjudged his approach, had tried to correct too aggressively, and had put the helicopter into a flight regime from which recovery was impossible at that altitude. The aviation community accepted the findings because the evidence supported them, because the NTSB had a reputation for thorough and impartial investigation, because accident reports like this one helped prevent future crashes by identifying failure points and training deficiencies. But the racing community struggled with it, couldn't quite reconcile the idea of Davey Allison, a man who'd spent his entire life mastering machines at speed, making such a fundamental error in judgment. Veteran pilots consulted by sports journalists expressed surprise and confusion. Davey was meticulous, one said. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He understood his limitations. Another pointed out that the approach to a helipad in perfect weather conditions was one of the most basic maneuvers in aviation. Something taught in the first 10 hours of training, something that should have been second nature to a pilot with 300 hours logged. Some aviation experts suggested a phenomenon called task fixation, where a pilot becomes so focused on one aspect of flight that they neglect others, where attention narrows to a single instrument or a single problem, and situational awareness collapses. Maybe Davey had been focused on the landing spot, on putting the helicopter down in exactly the right place, and had stopped monitoring altitude and airspeed. Maybe he'd been distracted by something in the cockpit, a gauge reading or a warning light, or even just a stray thought that pulled his attention away for 3 seconds, and 3 seconds at low altitude was all it took. Maybe the grief of losing his brother 11 months earlier was still there, sitting in the back of his mind, taking up mental bandwidth that should have been devoted to flying. The report mentioned none of this speculation because speculation wasn't evidence, wasn't data, wasn't something you could measure or quantify or photograph. The report stuck to facts. Pilot had certificate. Pilot had 300 hours experience. Aircraft was airworthy. Weather was good. Approach was unstable. Pilot failed to execute proper recovery. Aircraft crashed. Pilot died. These were the facts, laid out in clinical language, supported by mathematics and physics and the physical evidence scattered across a patch of Alabama grass. But facts don't always satisfy the human need for meaning, for narrative, for answers that feel complete. And in the days and weeks after the report's release, questions began to surface in racing forums and fan magazines and the early whispers of internet discussion groups that were just beginning to connect people across distances. Questions about the timing, about the strangeness of the Allison family losing 2 sons in less than a year, about whether 300 hours was really enough experience to be flying a helicopter worth $250,000. Questions about whether the investigation had been rushed, whether the NTSB had looked hard enough for alternative explanations, whether there was more to the story than a simple mistake by a tired pilot on a July afternoon. The official response was always the same. The investigation was thorough. The evidence was clear. The conclusion was sound. Pilot error, human mistake. The kind of accident that happens every day in aviation, the kind that fills logbooks and case files and memorial walls at flight schools across the country. Nothing mysterious, nothing sinister. Just tragedy, simple and complete and final. But simplicity, like facts, doesn't always satisfy. And sometimes the questions matter more than the answers, especially when the answers leave a hole in the shape of what might have been, what should have been, what never got the chance to be. The theories began in the quiet spaces where grief meets confusion, in the racing fan forums that existed in the mid-90s on bulletin board systems and early internet chat rooms, in the letters to the editor sections of motorsports magazines, in conversations held in garage areas and grandstands, where people who'd followed the Allison family for decades tried to make sense of what felt like an impossible pattern of loss. 3 deaths in such close succession. Clifford Allison, in August 1992, killed during practice at Michigan International Speedway when his car hit the wall at 180 miles per hour. Bobby Allison's father, dead. And now, Davey. 3 generations touched by tragedy in the span of less than a year. It didn't feel random, it didn't feel like bad luck. It felt like something else, something darker, something that people struggled to name but couldn't stop talking about. The first theory that gained traction called itself the Allison curse, and it spread through the racing community with the kind of speed usually reserved for scandals and controversies. The premise was simple, almost primal in its logic. The Allison family had been touched by something malevolent, some force or fate or cosmic imbalance that demanded payment in blood. Believers pointed to the pattern. Bobby Allison's near-fatal crash at Pocono in 1988, injuries so severe he'd never race again, brain damage that stole memories and left him diminished. Then Clifford, then Davey, 3 strikes in 5 years, each one taking something irreplaceable from a family that had given everything to stock car racing. Some pointed further back to earlier accidents and close calls, to a history of violence that seemed to follow the Allison name like a shadow. Superstition ran deep in Southern motorsports culture, deeper than most outsiders understood. Drivers had rituals and lucky charms and colors they wouldn't wear. Crew chiefs avoided certain numbers. Tracks had reputations, histories, ghosts. The idea of a family curse wasn't absurd to people who'd grown up in this world. It was almost logical. Then came the mechanical sabotage theory, darker and more specific, popular in the corners of the internet where conspiracy thinking flourished without editorial oversight or fact-checking. The Hughes 369HS had been recently purchased, recently maintained, and while the NTSB had found no evidence of mechanical failure, theorists argued that the investigation had been rushed, that the NTSB had a vested interest in protecting helicopter manufacturers from liability, that a more thorough examination might have revealed tampering with control systems or hydraulic lines or any of the dozens of components that needed to function perfectly for safe flight. They pointed to the fact that Davey had only owned the helicopter for 6 months, that the maintenance records showed work done by outside contractors, that anyone with access to the aircraft could have introduced a subtle fault that wouldn't manifest until the worst possible moment. The theory never gained mainstream acceptance because it required too many people to be complicit, too many professionals to miss obvious signs, too much coordination between disparate parties. But it persisted anyway, whispered in forums with handles instead of real names, elaborated on in late-night phone calls between people who'd convinced themselves they'd spotted a pattern no one else could see. A third theory focused not on mechanics, but on psychology, on the immense pressure Davey had been under in the months leading up to his death. He'd lost his brother. He was fighting for a championship. He was managing a race team and a family, and a public image and the weight of a legendary last name that came with expectations most people couldn't imagine. Some suggested that the helicopter represented an escape, a way to control something when so much else felt chaotic, but that it also represented another risk, another variable, another way for things to go catastrophically wrong. This theory whispered about sabotage of a different kind, about internal pressures and external influences, about rivalries within NASCAR that ran deeper than fans knew, about money and endorsements and the kind of high-stakes gambling that happened in shadows around professional sports. It suggested that someone might have benefited from Davey's death, financially or competitively, and that while they couldn't prove direct action, the circumstances felt convenient for certain parties. The theory never named names because naming names invited lawsuits, but it circulated anyway, adding layers of suspicion to an already murky narrative. And then there was Talladega itself, the track that some called cursed, long before Davey Allison fell from the sky above it. Bobby Isaac, legendary driver, had heard voices telling him to get out of his car during a race at Talladega in 1973, had climbed out mid-race and never driven competitively again, died of a heart attack a few years later. Larry Smith, killed in a crash during testing at Talladega in 1973. Multiple drivers over the years reporting strange feelings at the track, unease that went beyond normal pre-race nerves, sensations of being watched or followed or warned. Some local mystics and amateur historians claimed the land itself was tainted, that the speedway had been built on ground that held old violence, old grief, that Native American burial sites or Civil War battlefields lay beneath the asphalt and grandstands, that disturbing such places carried consequences. It was the kind of theory that sounded ridiculous in daylight, but felt plausible at 3 in the morning when you couldn't sleep, and the question of why kept circling through your head without finding an answer. The tabloids picked up these theories and ran with them because tabloids ran with anything that sold papers, anything that promised secrets and revelations and the kind of salacious details that made people stop at checkout counters and reach for their wallets. Allison family cursed by racing gods, one headline screamed. Helicopter sabotage suspected in NASCAR star's death, another claimed. The stories rarely contained new information, mostly just recycled speculation and quotes from unnamed sources and blurry photographs that proved nothing. But they kept the theories alive, kept them circulating, added fuel to conversations that NASCAR officials wished would die down but couldn't quite extinguish. The racing establishment responded with firm denials and appeals to reason. The NTSB report was thorough and conclusive. Pilot error was the cause. Tragic but explainable. Random but not mysterious. They pointed out that aviation accidents happened every day. That statistical probability meant even experienced pilots made fatal mistakes. That looking for patterns in tragedy was a natural human impulse, but not a reliable path to truth. They emphasized that Davey Allison had been a hero, that his legacy deserved better than conspiracy theories and supernatural speculation, that the family deserved privacy and respect and space to grieve without tabloid interference. But the theories persisted, because theories always persist when the official explanation feels incomplete, when the emotional weight of loss demands more than a single sentence in a government report. When people need the story to mean something beyond random chance and human fallibility, online forums dedicated to NASCAR history still debate the Allison curse. YouTube videos with dramatic titles and ominous music still examine the evidence for sabotage. Podcasters still interview anyone willing to suggest that maybe, possibly, there was more to the story than what the NTSB concluded. The theories have evolved over decades, incorporated new information, adapted to new platforms, but they've never quite disappeared. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the theories exist not because they're true, but because they serve a function, because they give meaning to loss, because they transform random tragedy into narrative, into something that can be discussed and debated, and ultimately, if never quite understood, at least acknowledged as more than just a mistake, just an accident, just another name on a long list of people who died too young doing things they loved. The NASCAR Hall of Fame inducted Davey Allison posthumously in 2011, 18 years after his death. A ceremony filled with tears and standing ovations and video montages that showed him young and alive and victorious, crossing finish lines with his fist pumped out the window, hoisting trophies, spraying champagne, living the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside, even though everyone who knew him understood the pressure that came with the last name, with the expectations. With being third generation in a sport that ate its heroes and demanded more. Liz Allison accepted the honor on behalf of her late husband, spoke about his dedication and his talent and his love for racing, and if her voice broke during the speech, if she had to pause and collect herself before continuing, no one in the audience judged her for it because grief doesn't follow a timeline, doesn't respect calendars or anniversaries or the polite expectation that people should be over it by now. Bobby Allison sat in the front row during that ceremony, 73 years old, body still carrying the scars from his own crash at Pocono 23 years earlier, mind still carrying the gaps where memories used to be, the neurological damage that had stolen pieces of his past and left him with a present that sometimes felt disconnected from everything that came before. He'd lost both his sons, Clifford first, then Davey 11 months later. The kind of loss that breaks people, that rewrites the fundamental equations of how life is supposed to work. Parents burying children, legacy ending not in triumph, but in tragedy, stacked on tragedy. Bobby had stopped attending races for years after Davey died, couldn't bear to be in the garage area where his sons should have been, couldn't watch other drivers celebrating victories that Davey would never have the chance to win. He came back eventually because racing was all he knew, but the joy was gone, replaced by something quieter and sadder and harder to name. Red Farmer survived the crash with physical injuries that healed over months, but psychological wounds that never quite closed. He kept flying because stopping would have meant letting fear win, but every approach to a helipad, every descent through 1,000 feet of altitude, carried with it the memory of that July afternoon, the moment when everything went wrong, the sound of impact and breaking metal and the terrible silence that followed. Survivor's guilt is a specific kind of torture, the constant question of why him and not me. Why did I walk away when someone better, someone younger, someone with so much more left to give didn't? Red never spoke publicly about those feelings, kept them private the way men of his generation often did. But people who knew him saw the weight, saw the way his expression changed when Davey's name came up in conversation, saw the careful distance he maintained from discussions about the accident and the investigation and the theories that swirled around it all. Neil Bonnett, the man Davey had been flying to visit that day, the mentor and friend who'd been standing at the helipad waiting and watching when the helicopter fell, died 7 months later in February 1994 during a practice session at Daytona International Speedway. He'd been attempting a comeback after his own injuries, trying to return to the sport he loved, and his car hit the wall in turn 4 at 150 miles per hour, and he was killed instantly. Another name added to the list of drivers who died doing what they loved. Another funeral where the racing community gathered to mourn and ask why and struggle with the randomness of it all. The timing felt impossible, felt like the universe was determined to complete some pattern that no one could see, but everyone could feel. Davey in July, Neil in February. 7 months between them. Close friends linked in death as they'd been in life, and the conspiracy theorists added it to their evidence pile, pointed to it as proof of something deeper, something darker, something that couldn't be explained by statistics or probability, or the simple fact that racing was dangerous and sometimes people died. The narrative structure of Davey Allison's death contains every element that makes tragedy compelling, every archetype and pattern that writers and filmmakers have used for centuries to explore the human relationship with fate and hubris and loss. There's the hero with natural talent, born into greatness, carrying a legendary name, expected to exceed even his father's accomplishments. There's the pride, the confidence that comes from mastery, the belief that skills in one domain transfer seamlessly to another, that 300 hours in a helicopter cockpit is enough because everything else has always been enough. There's the family curse angle, the generational pattern of violence and loss that feels less like coincidence and more like destiny written in blood. There's the premature death of someone young and vital and full of potential. The eternal question of what might have been if he'd lived, what championships he might have won, what records he might have broken, what legacy he might have built, beyond the incomplete one he left behind. The official explanation remains pilot error, a moment of inattention or misjudgment or task fixation that put a helicopter into an unrecoverable flight regime at an altitude that left no margin for correction. It's the simplest explanation, the one supported by evidence and physics and decades of aviation accident investigation experience. It's also the hardest explanation to accept emotionally, because it means that everything, all the loss and grief and shattered potential, came down to a few seconds of human mistake, to the kind of error that anyone could make, that even the most skilled pilot could make if circumstances aligned in exactly the wrong way. There's no villain in that story. No evil force, no conspiracy. Just a man trying to do something he'd done dozens of times before and making a mistake that cost him everything. But maybe the mundane explanation is actually more frightening than any conspiracy theory could ever be. Maybe the idea that life can pivot on 3 seconds of distraction, that decades of skill and experience can fail in a single moment, that random chance governs outcomes more than we want to admit, is scarier than curses, or sabotage, or malevolent forces. Because if Davey Allison, third-generation driver, natural athlete, careful and meticulous and aware of his limitations, could make a fatal error on a perfect July afternoon, in clear skies with unlimited visibility, then any of us could. Any moment could be the one where attention slips, where judgment fails, where the thin margin between safe and catastrophic disappears without warning. Or maybe, and this is where the theories find their foothold, maybe the timing really was too convenient, the pattern too clear, the losses too concentrated to be purely random. Maybe there are questions the NTSB report didn't answer, details that got overlooked in the rush to close the case, connections that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. Maybe someone did benefit from Davey's death. Maybe the helicopter had been compromised. Maybe Talladega really does carry some weight of past violence that manifests in present tragedy. The evidence doesn't support these theories, but the human need for meaning, for pattern, for stories that make sense sometimes outweighs evidence. Helicopter accidents continue to claim lives across all domains, not just racing, but business and entertainment and personal aviation. Kobe Bryant and his daughter in 2020. Colin McRae, rally champion, in 2007. Vic Morrow and 2 child actors in 1982. The list goes on. Names from different eras and different fields, united only by the fact that they died in rotary-wing aircraft that fell from the sky for various reasons, mechanical and human and environmental. There's no pattern connecting them beyond the simple fact that helicopters are unforgiving machines that demand constant attention and leave little room for error, that flight is inherently risky even under the best conditions, that the statistics on helicopter safety have improved over decades, but still reflect a higher accident rate than fixed-wing aviation. So why do heroes of speed, men and women who master ground vehicles with such skill and confidence, die so often when they take to the air. Maybe because the skills don't transfer as cleanly as they think. Maybe because the confidence that serves them well at 200 miles per hour on a racetrack becomes dangerous at 200 feet in three-dimensional space. Maybe because flying demands a different kind of attention, a different relationship with risk, a willingness to admit limitations that doesn't come naturally to people who've succeeded by pushing limits their entire lives. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe they fly because they're the kind of people who need speed and freedom, and the feeling of controlling powerful machines, and helicopters offer all of that in concentrated form, and sometimes the same qualities that make someone a great driver. The aggression and confidence and willingness to operate at the edge become liabilities in a cockpit where conservative decision-making and cautious restraint are the keys to survival. The truth, whatever it is, lives somewhere in the space between official reports and conspiracy theories, between documented facts and emotional intuition, between what we can prove and what we choose to believe. Davey Allison died in a helicopter crash on July 13, 1993, at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama. That much is certain. Everything else, the why and the how and the meaning, remains open to interpretation, subject to the lens through which each person views tragedy and loss and the random violence of a universe that doesn't owe us explanations or happy endings or even coherent narratives. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of chaos. Sometimes the stories are true, sometimes they're not. And sometimes, the most important thing isn't which story is accurate, but which story helps us keep going, keep living, keep flying, despite knowing how easily and completely it can all go wrong.